The first time Elara Voss saw the mountain man, he was pulling a grizzly bear off a mule with his bare hands, and she decided then and there that either he was the most foolish creature God had ever placed on this earth, or the most extraordinary. It was the autumn of 1874, and the Colorado Rockies were beginning to show their teeth. The aspens had gone gold overnight, their coin-shaped leaves trembling in a wind that smelled of pine resin, and the first cold breath of the season pressing down from the high peaks. Elara had been traveling for 11 days out of St. Louis, riding in a rattling supply wagon with a driver named Old Pete Garvey, who smelled of tobacco and said little, which she had initially appreciated and had since grown to deeply resent, because there was nothing in the world lonelier than a long silence shared with a stranger. She was 23 years old, a schoolteacher by training, hired on by a letter from the small township of Clearwater, Colorado, which had promised her a modest salary, a room above the general store, and the opportunity to bring proper education to children who were growing up knowing more about horseflesh than letters. She had not been promised bears. The bear, a black bear, she would learn later, though it looked enormous to her terrified city-bred eyes, had come down from the tree line and taken an aggressive interest in the mule hitched at the front of their wagon. Old Pete had scrambled off the bench seat with a speed that belied his arthritic knees and hidden himself behind a boulder without so much as a word of instruction to Elara, who sat frozen on her trunk in the wagon bed, her carpet bag clutched to her chest, staring at the black mass of fur and fury that had its jaws around the bridle of the mule and was shaking its great head back and forth with a terrifying lack of effort. Then the man came out of the trees. He had to have been 6 feet and 2 inches at least, maybe more, with shoulders that seemed to carry the width of a barn door and arms that strained the seams of his buckskin shirt. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar in loose, heavy waves, pushed back from his face with evident indifference. A beard, thick and neatly kept, covered a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from the granite of the mountains themselves. He moved with a quality that was not quite silence. His boots cracked through the pine needles, a branch snapped beneath his weight, but there was something unhurried and inevitable about his stride, like a river deciding to change course. He reached the bear in 5 strides. He grabbed it by the scruff of the neck with one enormous hand and by the loose skin at its shoulder with the other, and he hauled it backward with a grunt that echoed off the ridge, and the bear, shocked perhaps to have found something bigger than itself in the wilderness, wheeled around and crashed back into the brush without a sound of argument. The man watched it go. He set his hands on his hips. He looked at the trembling mule with something that resembled professional assessment, ran one hand down the animal's neck in a long, steadying stroke, and then he looked up at Elara, sitting in the wagon bed with her carpet bag pressed to her sternum like a shield. His eyes were a shade of gray that made her think of storm clouds and river stones and the precise color of the world just before dawn breaks it open. They were not unkind eyes. They were measuring eyes, and she had the unnerving sensation of being accurately counted. "You all right?" he said. His voice was low and unhurried, shaped by mountain air and long solitude. "I am now," she said, and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. He nodded once as though this was the only acceptable answer, and turned to look for Old Pete, who was emerging from behind his boulder with considerably less dignity than he had retreated behind it. His name, she would learn from Pete during the next hour of travel, was Cade Merritt. He had come to the Colorado mountains 11 years ago, when he was 21, with a fur trading outfit that subsequently dissolved, and he had simply never left. He trapped beaver and mink in the winter months, guided hunting parties out of Denver in the fall when he chose to tolerate the company, and spent the warmer months alone in a cabin he had built himself on the eastern slope of the mountain the locals called Hatchet Ridge. Nobody knew exactly where the cabin was. Nobody had been invited to find out. "He comes into Clearwater 3-4 times a year," Pete said, working his tobacco from one cheek to the other, sells his pelts at the trading post, drinks one whiskey at the saloon, buys what he needs and goes back up, does not talk to nobody more than he has to, scares most folks, to be honest. But he's a good man. Best man in this territory for my money, and I've been driving this route for 16 years. Elara absorbed all of this, watching the man who had introduced himself only as Cade ride ahead of them on a big roan horse that looked bred for endurance rather than elegance. His back was straight, He had offered to ride with them the remaining miles into Clearwater without being asked, and Pete had accepted with evident relief, and Cade had not asked whether Elara wanted the escort, which she found simultaneously high-handed and deeply practical. She was not sure what to make of him. She was not sure she had the vocabulary for him yet. Clearwater was a mining and ranching town of perhaps 400 souls, sitting in a valley carved between two ridges where a cold creek ran year-round, and the grass grew thick enough in summer to make cattlemen interested. There was a main street of packed earth, a saloon called the Copper Cup, a general store run by a man named Hiram Cole, a small church that doubled as a meeting hall, a blacksmith, a post office that was also a barber shop, and a schoolhouse that was new enough that the pine boards had not yet stopped weeping sap. The children of Clearwater numbered 22, ranging in age from 6 to 15, and their previous teacher had departed in the spring under circumstances that Pete declined to specify and that Elara decided not to press him on. She was shown to a room above the general store by Hiram Cole's wife, Margaret, a compact and competent woman of 40 who took one look at Elara's road-dusty appearance, clicked her tongue once, and produced hot water, a clean towel, and a bowl of venison stew with a speed that suggested she had been expecting someone in worse shape. "You'll do," Margaret said, with the air of a woman delivering a considered verdict. "You've got the eyes for it. Children can tell when an adult is truly paying attention to them. Most of your predecessors were not." "How many predecessors have there been?" Elara asked. 3 and 4 years, Margaret said. "Do not let that discourage you. 2 of them left for personal reasons unrelated to the children. The third was Mr. Alderman, who turned out to have a complicated relationship with honesty. But the children are good children. Rough around the edges, as one expects in a place like this, but good." Elara began teaching the following Monday. She was, it turned out, well suited to the work. She had grown up the daughter of a pastor in St. Louis, which had given her a patient faith in the eventual comprehension of difficult things, a habit of meeting people precisely where they stood rather than where she wished they would stand, and a voice that carried without being harsh. The children of Clearwater took 2 weeks to decide she was serious, another week to decide she was fair, and then gave her their complete and often exhausting loyalty. She did not see Cade Merritt again for 3 weeks. He came into town on a Friday afternoon in late October, riding the roan down the main street with a pack mule loaded with pelts behind him. The air had turned cold enough that she could see her breath at recess, and she was standing at the schoolhouse door watching the children race around in the golden light, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders when she saw him pass. He was watching the street with the particular focused attention of a man who trusts nothing he cannot see clearly. He glanced toward the schoolhouse and caught her looking. He did not smile. He did not wave. But something in his expression shifted, some brief and unguarded thing, before he turned back to the street and rode on. She told herself she had imagined it. That evening there was a gathering at the Copper Cup, not a wild affair, but the kind of communal loosening that a frontier town permitted itself on a Friday when the week had been hard. Several of the miners and cattlemen were there, along with their wives where they had them, and the schoolteacher's presence at such events was considered appropriate, so long as she did not stay past 9 and did not accept drinks from men she was not previously acquainted with. Margaret Cole had delivered these guidelines with the air of a woman who had written them herself. Elara sat with Margaret and a few of the other women at a table near the window, drinking coffee that tasted of the bottom of the pot and watching the room with the particular attention she brought to new environments. Cade Merritt was at the bar. True to Pete's description, he had a single glass of whiskey in front of him, which he was not rushing. He spoke to a few men, brief exchanges, mostly nods, and seemed to occupy his space at the bar with an ease that was somehow different from the ease of the other men, who leaned and sprawled and took up room with the performative confidence of men in their element. Cade simply stood as though he had grown from that specific spot of floor. It was Margaret who created the introduction, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided something should happen and saw no reason to wait for it to happen naturally. "Cade Merritt," she called, and he looked over from the bar with the unhurried precision of a man accustomed to being called and deciding freely whether to answer. He picked up his glass and walked over. "This is Miss Elara Voss, our new schoolteacher. She arrived 3 weeks ago." I remember, he said, looking at Elara. The wagon with the bear. That is one way to describe it, she said. You didn't scream, he said. This seemed to be a compliment, though it was delivered in the same tone he might use to observe that the weather was dry. I was too frightened to remember how, she said honestly. Something changed in his eyes then, a warmth, brief and carefully controlled, like a match struck in a large room. He pulled out a chair and sat down at Margaret's pointed gesture, and what Elara had assumed would be an awkward obligatory exchange of pleasantries became something else entirely. He was not, it turned out, a man without words. He was a man who had simply decided his words were worth keeping until there was somewhere worth spending them. He asked her about St. Louis, listening to her answers with a quality of attention that she found both flattering and unnerving. He knew more about the broader world than she might have expected, having read extensively during his long mountain winters from whatever books he could obtain, and he had opinions, carefully reasoned, not loudly held, about things she had read herself. He left at 10 o'clock, nodding to the room in general and to her in particular, and she watched him go and thought about the way he listened, and about his gray eyes, and about the fact that she had spent the last 3 hours forgetting to be cold. The weeks that followed built themselves into a pattern that neither of them formally acknowledged. He came into Clearwater every Friday when he was not snowed in on the mountain, which in October and early November was more often than not. He would stop at the Copper Cup. Elara would be there, or he would find occasion to pass the schoolhouse. They talked. The conversations grew longer and then somehow more essential, in the way that the body begins to require something it did not previously know existed. He told her about the mountain, about the way it changed through the seasons, the particular silence of a pine forest under 3 feet of snow, the sound a bull elk makes in the rut, the way the creek froze from the edges inward and thawed in the reverse order. He told it the way a man describes something he loves, with precision and reverence and without awareness that he is revealing himself. She told him about her father's library, about the river and sand. Louis, when the spring floods came and turned it the color of old copper, about her mother who had died when she was 15 and whose absence had taught her, unexpectedly, how to be alone. He listened to all of it. She noticed things about him with increasing frequency and detail, the way he automatically placed himself between her and the street when they stood outside, the way he tracked the room when he was in an enclosed space, not with anxiety, but with the settled competence of a man who plans ahead. The way his hands, which were large enough and scarred enough to have a history, could move with extraordinary gentleness. She had seen him once tie a bandage on a dog that had cut its paw on broken glass, and the care with which he worked had been privately devastating to witness. She also noticed that he never spoke about himself in the past, and that when she asked questions about his life before the mountains, he answered briefly and moved away from the subject with a smoothness that spoke of long practice. She did not push. She understood certain silences. She had her own. The first real test came in November, on a night of unusual cold that descended on the valley like a judgment. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours, which was not uncommon in Colorado at altitude, and which caught several of the townspeople without sufficient wood. Elara had run low herself, not knowing how quickly the room above the store could drain a woodpile, and she woke at 2 a.m. to a cold so penetrating it felt personal, with ice on the inside of the window glass and her breath making small clouds in the dark air. She had started a small fire and was feeding it carefully, rationing what she had left when she heard a knock at the door that led down to the store. She wrapped herself in her blanket and opened it to find Margaret Cole in a heavy coat and scarf, and behind her, carrying a cord of wood on his shoulder like it weighed nothing, Cade Merritt. He was sleeping at the livery, Margaret said, as though this explained everything, which in the practical logic of frontier life it did. He heard me worrying about the heat above the store. Cade set the wood down beside her stove and began splitting and stacking it with the efficiency of a man who has done exactly this 10,000 times. He did not look at her while he worked, but the lines of his back were careful in a way she could not fully articulate, careful the way a man is when he is trying not to show that something matters. When the stove was running hot and the chill in the room had been broken, he straightened and turned to leave. "Cade," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. It felt insufficient, but she did not have different words yet. He looked at her for a moment, in the firelight, with his gray eyes holding something she could not name but recognized in the way you recognize the approach of weather. Then he nodded and went out, and she stood by her warm stove for a long time afterward, not quite ready to sleep. November deepened into December, and December brought the first serious snowfall. The pass road was closed for a week, and during that week Clearwater contracted inward like an animal settling into its den. The schoolhouse continued operating on days when the snow was not actually falling, because children needed routine even more than they needed warmth, and Elara had developed the habit of keeping the school heated as long as there was wood and light enough to see by. It was during one of these snow-muffled December afternoons that Tommy Reeves, a 9-year-old whose father ran the livery stable, marched up to her desk after the other children had left and announced, with the surgical frankness of a child who has been listening to adult conversations and drawing conclusions, that Mr. Merritt had told his father that Miss Voss was the finest woman he had ever encountered in this territory. Elara set down her chalk with great care. "Did he?" she said. "Said it last Friday," Tommy reported. "Said she had good sense and steady eyes, and she wasn't afraid of things that ought to be frightening and was honest about things that ought to be honest." He considered this list. "My papa said that was Cade Merritt talking sweet, which is different from other people talking sweet because Cade Merritt only says true things." After Tommy left, Elara sat at her desk in the dimming light for a long time, with her hands folded and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She saw Cade 2 days later when he came into the general store while she was buying lamp oil and coffee. He was buying flour, a new skinning knife, and a quantity of salt, with the methodical focus of a man provisioning for a long stay indoors. He greeted her with his customary directness, and they fell into conversation with the ease that had by now become natural between them, and she thought about Tommy's message the entire time. She did not say anything about it. She was not sure what saying something would produce, and she had learned to be careful with things that mattered. But something had shifted in her, acknowledged or not, and it showed in small ways. She laughed more readily at the dry edges of his humor. She met his eyes with less of the conscious self-possession she usually brought to social encounters, and more of the simple directness that was her natural register. She asked him, at the end of their conversation, as he was pulling his coat on and she was tucking her purchases into her basket, whether the cabin on Hatchet Ridge was warm enough in the heavy snows. He paused, one arm in his coat sleeve, and looked at her. "It's warm enough," he said. "I built it for winter." "Good," she said. And then, because the warmth from the stove and the oil lamps was making the little store feel intimate in a way that encouraged honesty, "I think about the mountain sometimes, what it looks like from up there when the whole valley is white." "It looks like peace," he said simply, and went out, and the bell above the door rang once and was still. She thought about that word for weeks. The crisis that changed everything came in February, as crises in the mountain country often did, without warning, from a direction no one had watched closely enough. A man arrived in Clearwater on a bitter Wednesday morning, riding a horse that had been pushed too hard. His name was Silas Greer, and he was one of those men the West produced with depressing regularity, charming on the surface, with a smile that reached exactly as far as his teeth and stopped, and eyes that were busy in a way that had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with calculation. He said he was a land surveyor out of Denver. He showed papers that Margaret Cole's husband, Hiram, who had more experience of such things than most, examined with a quiet frown and declared looked official enough, though Hiram was careful not to say they looked real. Greer ate his supper at the Copper Cup with great social ease, and a traveling man's gift for making strangers feel known, and within 2 days of his arrival it was clear he had taken a focused interest in Elara. He appeared at the general store when she was there. He took to walking the route between the store and the schoolhouse at times that coincided with her passage. He was never frightening precisely, but he had the quality of a gate that swings open a degree at a time, each movement innocent and each movement bringing it further from closed. Elara was not a woman easily intimidated, but she was a woman who trusted her instincts. And her instincts said Silas Greer was something she did not want to become entangled with. She mentioned it to no one, because she was not entirely sure how to articulate what she felt, and she had not yet been in Clearwater long enough to know how freely a woman could name her discomfort about a man without being told she was reading too much into it. Cade arrived on a Friday afternoon in the teeth of a February wind. He rode down the main street, and she was at the window of the schoolhouse. The children had gone home early because of the cold, and she saw the exact moment he became aware of something in the town's atmosphere that was different from what he had left behind. He sat on the roan and read the street the way a man reads a trail, unhurried and thorough, and then his gaze moved to the front of the saloon, where Silas Greer was standing with two other men Elara did not recognize well, talking and watching the street. Cade dismounted and took his horse to the livery without looking at the saloon again, but she noticed that he was looking at it. She encountered him an hour later at the general store, where she had gone for salt. "Who is the man in the gray coat?" he said quietly, without preamble. He was standing at the counter, and his back was half turned, and he did not look at her when he spoke, which told her he already suspected the answer had something to do with her. "Silas Greer," she said. "He arrived Wednesday. Says he's a land surveyor. What does he want?" She hesitated for just a moment, and that hesitation was its own answer. Something in Cade's posture changed, not dramatically, not with any theatrical tightening of the shoulders, but in the way that stone changes when it takes on weight. He simply became more of what he already was, solid, present, immovable. "Has he said anything that made you uneasy?" Cade asked, and his voice was very quiet and very steady and entirely without anger, which somehow made it more serious than anger. "He has not said anything specific," she said honestly. "He is simply—" "Always where you are," Cade said. "Yes," she said. He bought his flour and salt and a length of rope. At the door, he paused. "I'm going to be in town through Sunday," he said. "I have some work at the trading post." He left a half-beat. "If you're going anywhere, it would be sensible to say so." She understood what he was offering. It was not a declaration. It was a fact, stated with the plain honesty that was his particular idiom. He was telling her that he would be there, that she would not have to navigate whatever Greer represented alone. "I have to go to the church tomorrow morning," she said, "to drop off some books I promised Pastor Henley." He nodded once. "I will walk with you." He did. And the following day, Greer, who had been moving with evident intention toward the church when he spotted Elara coming out of it, checked his step when he saw who was beside her. The calculation in his eyes flickered, reassessed, and concluded. He nodded pleasantly enough and walked on. And within 3 days he had ridden out of Clearwater under circumstances that Hiram Cole described, with satisfaction, as involving a quiet conversation between himself, the sheriff, and Cade Merritt about the nature of the documents Greer had been presenting. They were, as it turned out, forgeries. Greer had been working a land claim fraud in 3 other Colorado towns before Clearwater. He did not come back. The night after Greer left, Cade came to the general store, where Elara was helping Margaret inventory the winter goods. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. She had rarely seen him without the hat, and there was something unexpectedly exposed about the gesture. And he said, addressing the room in general, and her in particular, that he was glad the matter was resolved. Then he looked directly at her, with those gray eyes that gave nothing away, and simultaneously gave everything away, and said, "You would have managed without me." She set down her inventory book. "I know," she said, "but it was better with you." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained an enormous amount of information. Margaret Cole made a small sound that might charitably have been described as a cough and found urgent business at the far end of the store. Elara and Cade stood in the lamplight looking at each other, and something that had been building since a bear and a wagon and a pair of gray eyes decided it did not want to be patient any longer. "I would like to take you riding," he said, "when the weather clears, if you would want that." "I would want that," she said. He put his hat back on, nodded with a formality that was undercut entirely by the fact that he was smiling, which was not something she had seen him do fully until that moment, and it was a devastating smile, the kind that rewrites a person's face entirely, opening it into something warm and wrecked and real. "Sunday, then," he said, "weather permitting." "Weather permitting," she agreed. He went out. She stood very still in the lamplight for a moment. Then she picked up her inventory book and went back to work. And if her hands were not entirely steady, Margaret had the grace not to mention it. the weather permitted on Sunday. He arrived at the general store with the roan and a smaller bay mare that he had borrowed from the livery. A gentle animal, he explained, with a mouth like velvet, which turned out to be accurate. They rode north along the creek for the better part of 2 hours, into a winter landscape that was so quiet and so brilliantly white, it felt like being inside a cathedral. The mountains stood up around them in their full immensity, the highest peaks lost in cloud, the lower slopes thick with pine that held snow in their branches like offerings. Cade rode beside her without speaking for long stretches, which he had learned was not indifference, but a form of comfort. He did not feel the need to fill silence with sound, and riding beside him in the white quiet was the most genuinely restful thing she had felt since leaving St. Louis. Then he would speak, and what he said was always worth the wait. He pointed out the line of a wolf track crossing the snow on the far bank of the creek. He showed her where the creek ice was thinnest over the fast-moving shallows. He noted a pair of ravens following them at a distance, curious and unhurried. "They follow me sometimes," he said, "particularly in winter. They have learned that where I go, something gets skinned eventually." "That's a very practical relationship," she said. "Most good relationships are," he said, and then looked at her sidelong with that fractional half-smile that was better than most men's full grins, and she felt the warmth of it go all the way down to her cold hands. They stopped where the creek bent around a granite outcrop, and the snow lay in a perfect unblemished sheet on a flat bank, and the mountains were framed precisely as though someone had planned it. They tied the horses and stood at the edge of the bank, and the silence was enormous and generous and full of light. "You built your cabin up there," she said, looking at the ridgeline. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "Why Colorado?" she asked. "You could have guided those trappers anywhere." He was quiet for a moment, and she respected the pause. She had learned that he did not say things until he had located the exact truth of them. "I came through this valley in June, the first year," he said. "The grass was up to the horses' knees and the creek was running hard from snowmelt, and there were elk on the ridge at first light, maybe 40 of them. I had never seen anything in my life that made me feel like something small and grateful all at once." He looked at the ridge. "When the outfit moved on, I stayed." She thought about that for a long time. "I think," she said carefully, "that most people spend their whole lives looking for a place that makes them feel that way." He turned and looked at her, and his gray eyes were entirely unguarded for the first time she had seen. And what was in them was not the careful management of a private man, but something raw and honest and startlingly young. And she understood then, in the full and certain way that you understand only a handful of things in your life, that she was in love with him. It arrived not as a shock, but as a recognition, the way you sometimes step around a corner and find a landscape you somehow already know. She did not say it. It was too new and too large. But she looked back at the ridge and stood beside him in the snow, their breath rising together in the cold air, and thought, "There it is." Spring came in stages, the way it always does in mountain country, tentatively at first, with days that promised warmth and nights that reneged, and with the warming ground came the complicated machinery of life resuming. The creek ran high and noisy with snowmelt. The aspens put out their first tentative leaves, pale green and translucent. The children of Clearwater stopped wearing their heaviest coats to school and became electric with the seasonal energy that drove teachers and parents to the edge of reason. Cade began coming down from the mountain more frequently. He had no explicit reason, and she had no explicit reason to expect him, but he came, and she was there, and the visits lengthened from an hour to 2 to entire afternoons, spent walking the valley while the light turned long and golden and the birds came back in their numbers. He was learning her, the rhythm of how she thought, the things that made her laugh, the silences that meant she was working through something difficult versus the silences that meant she was simply content. She was learning him with equal thoroughness. He brought her things from the mountain, not gifts in the formal sense, nothing wrapped, nothing presented with ceremony, but objects offered with the matter-of-fact simplicity of a man sharing what he loves. A piece of quartz crystal, the size of her fist, shot through with purple, that he had turned up while digging near the cabin. A single, perfect eagle feather, iridescent in the morning light. A small book of pressed flowers, each flower labeled in a careful hand, that he had made himself over several winters as a form of identification record. She set the book on her desk in the schoolroom, and her students asked about it every day for a week. On an evening in early April, sitting on the front steps of the general store with the western sky turning colors that no painter could have justified, he told her about the one thing he had not spoken of. He told it simply, without drama, as though he had been waiting to trust someone with it and had finally decided she was the right person. His mother had died when he was 12, in Kentucky, on a farm that had never been more than a going concern, leaving behind his father and 3 younger siblings. His father was not a bad man, he said, but he was a man hollowed out by grief and by drink, and by the time Cade was 16, the farm was failing and his siblings were hungry more nights than not, and he had worked every job he could find in 3 counties to keep them fed. He had left at 21 when the youngest was settled and the eldest had married, leaving enough money to keep the farm another year. And he had come west with the trappers because it was the direction of going that felt most like starting again. I sent money back for a long time, he said, until I knew they were steady. And now, she said, my sister Margaret, named for no relation to your Margaret Cole, writes me twice a year. The farm is sold. They are all in different states. They are well. He was quiet. I did not intend to live this alone. It is simply what happened while I was not deciding anything different. She put her hand over his, there on the wooden steps in the fading April light, and his hand was warm and very large and entirely still. I think, she said quietly, that some decisions make themselves when you stop deciding against them. He turned his hand under hers and held it, and they sat in the warm dusk watching the sky go dark, and neither of them said anything more, because nothing more needed saying right then. April became May, and May brought the recklessness of high spring. The meadows above the valley were full of wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, columbine, wild iris, and the air smelled of them on the warm afternoons. The school was in its final weeks of term, and Elara's students were performing the complicated social calculus of children who are fond of their teacher and resentful that the outdoors exists and keeps calling to them through the window. She and Cade rode up to the high meadow on a Saturday in mid-May, higher than they had gone before, the horses working against the grade of the trail. He knew the mountain the way she knew the face of someone loved, every elevation, every change in the ground, the place where the trail made a deceptive switchback that could send an unfamiliar rider wrong. He talked her through it without condescension, simply narrating the terrain the way a man narrates a country to someone he wants to know it. When they reached the meadow, she understood why he had brought her here. It lay in a bowl between 3 ridges, maybe an acre of flat ground, and the flowers were extraordinary, dense and wild and colored in a way that seemed almost unreasonable given the severity of what surrounded them. The mountains stood up in every direction, white-capped and enormous, and the sky above was a blue so deep it ached. "This is where I come when I need to remember what any of it is for," he said. She stood in the flowers and looked at him, this large, quiet, serious man who had carved a life out of wilderness and solitude, who listened like it was a gift he was giving rather than receiving, who had held her hand on a wooden step and asked for nothing more than her presence, and the love she had recognized in February had deepened into something architectural. It was part of how she was built now, the same way the mountain was part of how he was built. "Cade," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going back to St. Louis," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not. I was never going to stay only a year. I've not been here long, but this is—" She gestured imprecisely at the mountains and the flowers in the valley below, and perhaps at him. "This is what I came looking for." He was very still. "You came looking for a school," he said. "I came looking for the place that makes me feel small and grateful all at once," she said. He crossed the meadow to her in 6 strides. He stood in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to hold his eyes, and his gray eyes were doing that thing they did when he was not managing himself, when something had gotten past the quiet, careful frontier he maintained, and what was there was so open and so honest that it was almost difficult to look at directly. "Elara," he said, and her name in his mouth was something entirely new, the way the same word in a different language can mean the same thing and mean it more. He cupped her face in his hands, those large, scarred, gentle hands, and he kissed her, and the mountains went on being enormous all around them, and the flowers went on being unreasonably colored, and the kiss was unhurried and certain, and tasted of cold water and pine and something that felt very much like the end of a long journey. When they came apart, she kept her hands on his arms, feeling the solidity of him. "I have been trying not to say anything for 4 months, he said, his voice rougher than usual and lower. "I know," she said. "I have been having similar difficulties." He laughed, and it was the full laugh she had not heard before, and it was as good as the smile had been. It changed his whole face, softening the granite into something warmer and more habitable. They came down from the mountain in the late afternoon, riding close together, and when they reached the valley, the town lay in its familiar order below them, smoke from the chimneys rising straight in the still air. She looked at it, and it looked like hers. She looked at him, and he looked like the rest of that thought. The summer of 1875 was long and hot and extraordinary. The valley baked golden in July and August. The creek dropped to half its spring volume, and the days stretched out so long that the light was still in the sky at 9 at night, long after the children had gone home and the town had quieted to its evening register. Elara and Cade spent those long summer evenings in each other's company with a regularity that was not quite announced and was universally understood by the population of Clearwater, which had opinions about it in the comfortable, supportive way that small towns can have opinions about things when those things are making people they like visibly happier. He came down from the mountain twice a week through the summer, and sometimes they rode, and sometimes they simply walked the valley, and sometimes they sat on the steps of the general store with coffee and talked until the stars were thick overhead. She learned the full geography of him, his silences and his sudden precise remarks that cut to the center of things, his physical stillness that made his rare gestures significant, the way he could be completely present in a conversation and completely absent from it within the same minute, if something in the environment required his attention. She told him about her mother, finally, in July, sitting by the creek in the long evening light, about the illness that had taken her slowly over the winter. Elara was 14, turning 15, and the particular desolation of watching someone recede while being unable to do anything useful. About learning to cook and manage a household at 15, because her father was a man who poured his grief into his work and needed someone to hold the practical world together. About discovering, somewhere in that difficult year, that she was capable of more than she had known. He listened with the focused entirety of his attention, and when she finished, he said, "She raised you right, simply and with great conviction, and it was the right thing, precisely the right thing." And she turned her face away for a moment and worked at composure. He reached over and covered her hand with his and said nothing else, and she thought, this is what it is to be known. They spoke that summer about the future with increasing directness. He had been thinking, he said one evening in August, about expanding the cabin. It was built for one, but it was also built well, and he knew how to add to it. He said this looking at the mountain rather than at her, which she had learned was how he managed the making of important statements. He aimed them at the landscape so that she could accept or refuse them without the full weight of his attention bearing down on the moment. She looked at the mountain with him. "How much would you need to add?" she said. "A room to the east side," he said. "Good light in the morning, and the porch needs to be larger if 2 people are sitting on it regularly." She turned and looked at him then, and he turned and looked at her, and they were smiling at each other in the warm evening air with the full knowledge of what they were talking about, and it was the most domestic and the most enormous conversation she had ever had. "Ask me properly," she said. He turned fully toward her then, and his gray eyes were direct and warm and entirely without their customary reservation, and he said, "Elara Voss, I have been alone for 11 years because nothing and no one has ever made the alternative seem better than the mountain. You make the alternative seem better than everything I have ever known. I would like to marry you if you'll have a man whose world has mostly been trees and cold weather, and I would like to build you the porch and the morning room and whatever else comes after." "I will absolutely have that man," she said. He took a breath that was not entirely steady and reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a ring. A simple band of silver, plain and solid, with a small piece of that purple quartz set into it, the same crystal he had brought her from the mountain in the spring. "You planned this," she said, delighted. "I had it made in April," he said. "I have been waiting for a moment that seemed appropriate." "You waited 4 months. I'm a patient man." She held out her hand and he put the ring on her finger, and it fit exactly right, because he was a man who, when he set his mind to a thing, did it correctly. They were married in September in the small church in Clearwater, with Pastor Henley presiding and the entire town present in its best clothes, and considerably more emotion than it was comfortable to admit to. Margaret Cole cried with the vigorous practicality of a woman who had known all along that this was how things would go, and was gratified to be proven right. Old Pete Garvey was there, grinning with his tobacco-stained smile, and Tommy Reeves sat in the front pew with his parents and looked profoundly satisfied, as a boy who had delivered important intelligence deserves to look. Cade stood at the altar in his cleanest clothes, his dark hair pushed back from his face, his jaw shaved for the occasion, and the mountain itself could not have looked more solid or more serious. When he turned to watch her come down the aisle, his expression did not change in any theatrical way, but his chest expanded once on a long, slow breath, and his eyes did not leave her for the length of the entire ceremony. She wore her mother's ring until that morning, and her new ring after it, and the weight of both felt like being held by the right things. They spent the first week of their marriage at the cabin on Hatchet Ridge, and she understood then what he had meant when he said the mountain was the most beautiful thing he had ever known. The cabin was built against a south-facing slope, sheltered from the worst weather but open to the morning sun, with a view down into the valley that took her breath away every time she stepped out the door. The interior was simple and clean, and arranged with the practical intelligence of a man who lived alone by choice, everything in its right place, nothing unnecessary, but nothing harsh either. There were the books, a full shelf of them, well worn. There was a table he had made himself, with 2 chairs that suggested he had always intended a second one, though she did not point this out. There was a window above the kitchen table that looked directly into the pine forest, and in the mornings she sat there with her coffee and watched the trees change as the light shifted, and thought that she had found, exactly as she had told him she would, the place that made her feel small and grateful all at once. He showed her the mountain the way he had been saving it to show her, with the deliberate care of a man unwrapping something precious. The trail to the high meadow, the ridge where the elk came at dawn, the grove of ancient Douglas firs whose canopy was so dense that snow barely penetrated it, and where the ground was soft and dark with centuries of needles. The creek that ran behind the cabin through the winter, never quite freezing because it ran too fast. On their last evening before returning to the valley, she stood on the new porch. He had already begun adding to it over the summer, with the quiet focus of a man building toward something, and looked at the mountains going purple and gold in the fading light, and felt his warmth behind her as he came to stand at her back, his arms coming around her in the simple physical fact of him. "I want to tell you something," he said quietly against her hair. "Tell me," she said. "I have not been a man who—" He stopped, assembled himself, which he had learned to wait for. "I have not let many things matter. I built this to be a life that could not be taken from me because I had given no hostages to anything. I thought that was wisdom." A pause. It was not wisdom. It was just the thing I could manage. She turned in his arms and looked up at him, and the mountain light was in his gray eyes, and his face was entirely open, and she had never seen him look quite like this. Not vulnerable, because that was not the right word for someone this solid, but exposed, willingly exposed, the way a great rock face is exposed when the trees grow back from it and you can see its full extent. "I know," she said gently. "You managed it very well, and then you stopped needing to manage it." He pulled her closer and pressed his face against the top of her head, and she felt him exhale, a long and very complete breath, and in the lengthening silence of the mountain evening, she heard, felt, more accurately, felt against her, the thing she had not expected. His chest shook. Once. A single, controlled, involuntary shudder, and when she looked up at his face, there were tears on it, one streak down each side, moving through his beard, and his jaw was set hard against whatever was happening to him. She had never seen him cry. She would come to understand, in the years that followed, that she never saw it again. He had wept once, standing on the porch of his cabin with the mountains going dark around them and the woman he loved held against his chest. And it was not grief, but its opposite. The sudden devastating relief of a man who has been carrying a thing alone for so long that setting it down felt like a kind of undoing. She reached up and touched his face, and he caught her hand and pressed it there against his cheek, and his eyes closed. "Stay," he said, which was not a question, but had the quality of a question, had the vulnerability of the only question that had ever truly frightened him, which was not whether bears would come or winters would be severe or the world would be dangerous, because he knew how to manage all of those things, but whether this impossible specific warmth that had found him in his mountain solitude, whether this would stay. "I am staying," she said. She said it quietly, the way you say things that are permanently true, things that don't require volume. "I am staying with you. I'm staying right here." He held her, and the mountains held them, and the stars came out one by one in the darkening sky above Hatchet Ridge. That was the only night in his life that Cade Merritt wept. He never spoke of it, and she never pressed him on it, because some things are most truly honored by being kept. But she remembered it every day of her life, the particular quality of that evening, the weight of his arms, the mountains in their patient enormity, and the whispered certainty with which she had given him the only thing he had ever truly needed, the knowledge that she would stay. The autumn following their marriage was the most beautiful one she had ever seen. She had no objective basis for comparison with previous autumns, but she was certain anyway, because beauty, she was learning, is partly a function of the person you are standing next to when you see it. They divided their time between the cabin and the town through the fall. She continued teaching. The school board had asked her to stay on, and she had no intention of leaving the 22 children who had become, in their various configurations of brilliance and difficulty, a significant portion of her emotional territory. Cade began making more regular trade runs to Denver, expanding his operation from pure trapping to include some guiding and some trade in the fine-worked leather goods he had discovered over the winter that he was unexpectedly skilled at producing. He was not a man who discussed money directly, but he was a man who planned, and the planning was evident in the careful attention he brought to the economics of their new shared life. She noticed things she had not been in a position to notice before their marriage. The way he organized his days with a precision that allowed him to be efficient and unhurried at the same time. The way he had apparently had strong opinions about the arrangement of the kitchen, which he had said nothing about until she moved the coffee tin, and then expressed with great restraint and a minimum of words. She put the coffee tin back in its original location, and he said, "Thank you," with the sincere gravity of a man for whom this was not a small matter, and she kept her laughter to herself and filed it away as something precious. He learned to read the signs of her moods with the same attentiveness he brought to the mountain. Not anxiously, not hovering, but with the patient accuracy of a man who considers knowing someone well to be one of the central skills of a worthwhile life. He could tell the difference between her quiet that meant she was composing letters and her quiet that meant she was worried about a student, and his response to each was appropriately calibrated. He brought her coffee when she was writing. He sat beside her when she was worried, and let the worry work itself out in conversation or silence, whichever she needed. In November, she told him she thought she might be pregnant. He was at the kitchen table cleaning his rifle when she said it, with the methodical attention he brought to all equipment maintenance, and he set the rifle down with great care and looked at her across the table with an expression that was so completely undefended, so entirely stripped of his habitual quiet management, that she thought he might say something astonishing. What he said was, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am better than well." He stood up from the table, which took him to his full height, and crossed to where she was standing at the window, and he took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long time with those gray eyes that she had come to know as well as she knew her own. And then he pulled her into his chest and held her with the kind of careful, extraordinary care that the largest and strongest people sometimes bring to the things they are most afraid of breaking. "I did not think," he started. "You were not planning this particular thing," she said into his chest. "No," he said, "but I find I have never wanted anything more in my life." "Good," she said, "because it appears to be happening regardless." He laughed, and she felt it through her whole body, the rumble of it in his chest, and she thought, "We are going to be very happy." The winter of 1875 into 1876 was a good one, cold and clean, with enough snow to keep the mountain beautiful and not so much as to be dangerous. They spent most of it at the cabin, coming down to town on Fridays and returning Sunday. She grew into her pregnancy with the practical matter-of-factness of a woman who has always approached her body's processes with respect and without drama. Cade educated himself on the subject with the thoroughness he brought to all subjects he decided mattered, acquiring a medical text from Denver and reading it with such serious focus that she finally took it away from him in January after he had begun arriving at supper with new concerns to report. "The book is written for doctors," she said, "who are working with worst cases. We are not a worst case." "You cannot know that in advance," he said. "I can make a reasonable assessment," she said. "I am strong, I am healthy, I am living at altitude which is not ideal but is not dangerous, and we are 4 hours from the best doctor in Clearwater. We are going to be fine." He gave her the measuring look that meant he was weighing what she said against his own assessment and would report his conclusion when he had one. "I am moving us to the townhouse in March," he said. This was a new development. He had bought a small house on the edge of Clearwater in December, a practical purchase driven by exactly the reasoning he was now deploying. "We are already planning to be in town by March," she pointed out. "I'm noting that I have already planned for this," he said, with the careful dignity of a man who needs you to know he has been responsible. She went to him and kissed him and said, "You are going to be a magnificent father." And he held her tightly and said nothing, but she felt his arms go around her with everything he could not yet articulate. Their son was born in April of 1876, on a morning of pale spring light with the creak audible through the open window, assisted by Margaret Cole and a midwife from the eastern end of the valley who had more experience than the town doctor and was universally preferred by the women of Clearwater. Cade was in the house, and Margaret later reported that he had sat in the kitchen for 7 hours with his hands on his knees, and his jaw set in a stillness so absolute that she had checked twice to make sure he was breathing. When she brought him in and he saw Elara propped against the pillows with the flush of labor still in her cheeks and the baby in her arms, he crossed the room in 2 strides and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that Margaret Cole described to her husband Hiram that evening as the most private thing she had ever accidentally witnessed, and she was not going to describe it further, and Hiram was to understand that it was the good kind of private. The boy had Cade's dark hair and his mother's determined mouth, and he was named James after Elara's father. Cade held him with the preternatural care he brought to fragile things, which was most things these days, and James stared up at his father with the philosophical blankness of the very newly arrived, and Cade looked back at him as though taking a full accounting of everything he had not known he was missing. "Hello, James," he said very quietly. "I am your father. I will not let anything hurt you." Elara watched this exchange from her pillows and thought, there it is again. That particular quality of being exactly right, of a thing being precisely what it should be. The summer of 1876 was full of James, who turned out to be a baby of strong opinions and excellent lungs, and of the particular reordering of existence that comes with a first child. The cabin on Hatchet Ridge became a place they visited rather than lived in through the warmest months, though Cade took James up once in July, at 4 months, strapped to his chest in the carrier he had made for the purpose, and the 3 of them sat on the expanding porch while the mountain spread itself around them in its high summer dress of green and gold. Elara watched Cade watch James, who was watching the trees with the focused intensity of a person encountering the concept of trees for the first time, and thought about the night on that porch when she had felt his tears on his face and heard him say, "Stay." She thought about it not with any sadness, but with the quiet, deep satisfaction of a woman who has lived into the truth of a promise she once made. "He loves it here," Cade said, watching his son track the movement of a magpie in the pines. "He loves wherever you are," she said. He looked at her then, and it was the high meadow look, the unguarded one, and he reached over and took her hand, and held it with that simple, steadfast grip that was one of the basic facts of her life now. "I think about those first months sometimes," he said, "when you arrived." "The bear," she said. "Before that," he said. "I was coming down from the ridge to buy salt, and I saw the wagon on the road, and I knew, I don't know how to say this exactly, I knew there was someone in it who was going to matter." She stared at him. "You never told me that," she said. "It seemed," he considered, "a strange thing to say. How does a man know something like that?" "The same way I sat in that wagon and thought you were either foolish or extraordinary," she said. "Which did you decide?" "Both," she said. "The answer is always both." He laughed, and James, startled by the sound, looked up at his father's face with an expression of complete astonishment, and then laughed himself, a pure and explosive infant laugh that brought the magpie wheeling back to investigate, and all three of them on the porch in the mountain sun were laughing together, and it was, Elara thought, the most perfect sound the mountain had ever held. The years that followed built themselves into a life with the accumulated detail of actual living, not the broad strokes of story, but the specific and unrepeatable particulars that make up the genuine article. The winters in which the snow came early and they were snowbound at the cabin for days at a stretch, and those days were not hardship, but a form of abundance. The school terms that brought new children and new challenges, the student who had arrived at 8 speaking no English and left at 12 reading Shakespeare with a fluency that made Elara's heart expand sideways. The trading runs to Denver that grew into a modest but real enterprise, with Cade's leatherwork finding buyers among the merchant class of the city who had more money than expected and better taste than advertised. The spring of 1878 brought their second child, a daughter they named Rose, who arrived in the world with her father's gray eyes and her mother's absolute certainty, and who had by her second birthday made it clear that she intended to be an authority on everything within her reach, which delighted her father to an extent he was poorly equipped to conceal. He read to both children in the evenings, seated at the kitchen table with James on one knee and Rose on the other, working through the books with the same focused attention he brought to everything. And his voice, reading aloud in the lamplight, was one of the sounds Elara would always associate with home. James grew into his father's solidity, quiet, observant, a boy who spent hours watching the animals near the cabin with a patience extraordinary for his age, who could track a rabbit through wet grass by the time he was 6. Rose grew into her mother's directness and then considerably beyond it, developing opinions about everything from the proper way to braid a horse's mane to the injustice of bedtime, with a conviction and velocity that occasionally left both parents blinking. She was magnificent. They were, Elara thought on a regular basis, a noisy and improbable and entirely real family, assembled from a bear and a wagon and a pair of gray eyes and a woman who had been looking for the place that made her feel small and grateful all at once. Clearwater grew through the late 1870s as Colorado continued to grow, brought by the railroads that were threading their way into the mountains and the silver strikes that kept turning up in neighboring valleys. New families arrived. The school expanded, requiring a second teacher, and Elara hired a young woman from Cincinnati named Clara, who had her father's patient faith and her mother's steady hands and was, Elara was relieved to discover, exactly as good with children as her letters had suggested. The town acquired a second saloon, a physician who stayed, a small hotel, and the ongoing arguments about whether the road south should be improved that constituted, in any frontier town, a form of civic engagement. Cade watched the town's growth with the measured acceptance of a man who had seen enough history to know that things always changed, and the question was always whether you changed with them wisely. He made no secret of his preference for the mountain over the town, but he was not a man who confused preference with destiny, and the life they had built together was, he said once, on a quiet evening in the spring of 1879, exactly what it ought to be. He said it the way he said important things, simply and directly, and aimed slightly away from her so she could have it without its full weight, and she said she thought so too, and they sat on the porch of the townhouse in the warm evening with the sound of children settling to sleep inside, and the mountains stood in their permanent distance, and the stars came out over Hatchet Ridge. In the summer of 1879, when James was 3 and Rose was 1, and the mountain was showing off in the extravagant way it had every July, Cade finished the cabin additions he had been working on for 2 years. The East Room, with its morning light, the enlarged porch, a proper second bedroom, small but solid, with a window that looked into the pines. He walked her through it on a Saturday in July, carrying Rose on his shoulder because she refused to be set down, with James running ahead of them into each room with the proprietary inspection of a child who has been watching construction and considers himself a stakeholder. The cabin was a beautiful thing. It had been built by a man who knew what he was doing, and every addition had been built with the same honesty. Nothing decorative that wasn't also functional, nothing functional that wasn't also made with care. She ran her hand along the window frame of the East Room, feeling the smooth, careful work of it. "You did all of this yourself," she said. "Most of it," he said. "Tommy Reeves's older brother helped with the framing in the spring. He is good with wood." "It is perfect," she said. He looked at her over the top of Rose's head, his daughter leaning out from his shoulder to investigate the window glass with both hands, and his face was the open mountain light face, the one she loved most. "I built it for you," he said, not sentimentally, but as a simple true statement of the matter, the way he said all true things. "I have been building it for you since before I knew it was you I was building it for." She crossed the East Room and kissed him carefully around the obstacle of Rose, who objected to being squeezed by attempting to climb her father's head, and James ran back in from the next room, shouting about a squirrel he had seen through the window, and the cabin rang with all of them at once, and outside, the mountain went on being magnificent. On a November evening in 1880, with the first serious snow of the season coming down outside, and the stove going strong, and the children asleep in the cabin's new bedroom, Elara sat at the kitchen table, writing letters, while Cade worked on a piece of leather at the other end of the table. The lamp between them made a warm circle. The snow made a quiet sound against the window. The world outside was white and still and enormous, and the world inside was small and lit and theirs. She looked up from her letter and watched him work for a moment, the focused economy of his hands, the line of his shoulders in the lamplight, the way his dark hair fell forward slightly when he bent over the work. 6 years now, since the bear and the wagon, 6 years of conversations and silences and mornings in mountain meadows and evenings on wooden steps, and the particular education of knowing another person so well that you stop being surprised by them and start being amazed instead. 6 years that had become the whole structure of her. He looked up, sensing her attention the way he always did, and caught her watching. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I'm looking at you." "You've been looking at me for 6 years," he said. "I've not finished," she said. He smiled, that full opening smile that still rewrote his face entirely, and went back to his work, and she went back to her letter, and the snow came down, and the fire held, and outside the mountain carried its white weight with the patient ease of something built for exactly this. She finished her letter, sealed it, and set it aside. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside his elbow, and he said thank you without looking up. She sat back down and wrapped her hands around her cup and listened to the snow and the fire and the quiet sound of his breathing. "Cade," she said. He said, still on the leather. "I was thinking about the night we were first here together. After the wedding." He looked up then. "The porch," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and his gray eyes were very still, and she could see him with that in his mind. The mountain evening, the tears he would carry privately forever, the word he had said, and the answer she had given. "I have thought about it many times," he said. "I know," she said. "I have too. I just want you to know." She turned her coffee cup in her hands, finding words that were already perfectly clear but needed to be said anyway, needed to be said out loud in the lamplight with the snow coming down and the children asleep and the 6 years of the thing solid around them. "I have never once, not for a single day, not for an hour, thought about anywhere else, or anyone else, or any life other than this one." He set down the leather and looked at her, and she looked back, and the lamplight was between them, warm and honest. "Neither have I," he said. There was a silence. The good kind. The kind built out of 6 years of understanding what silence could hold. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his leather. The snow came down on Hatchet Ridge, patient and white and beautiful. And in the cabin, the lamp burned through the night with the steady certainty of something that had found its proper place and had no intention of going anywhere else. In the spring of 1882, Elara found out she was carrying their third child, and she told Cade on the porch of the cabin in the afternoon light, with the valley spread below them in its April green. He was quiet for a moment, and then he stood up from his chair and lifted her out of hers, simply lifted her with the same unhurried strength with which he had once pulled a bear off a mule, and held her for a long time without speaking, and she laughed against his shoulder and said, "Put me down, you enormous man." And he did, and he was grinning. "A third," he said. "A third," she confirmed. "James will be overjoyed," he said. "Rose will attempt to be in charge of it." "Rose is in charge of everything," Elara said. "She comes by it honestly," Cade said, with a look that suggested he was not referring to himself. The third child, another son, came into the world in October of 1882, on a crisp fall morning when the aspens were at their absolute gold, and they named him Thomas, for old Pete Garvey's given name, because Pete had died the previous winter at a dignified old age, and had been the first person in Clearwater to welcome Elara without reservation or agenda, and she had not forgotten it. Thomas arrived in the world with a great deal of energy, and Cade's gray eyes, and apparently opinions about the immediate situation which he expressed at length and volume, and the cabin on Hatchet Ridge, already considerable, resonated with the sound of 3 children for the first time. James, 6, regarded his new brother with the grave and interested assessment of a child who has been told this is important and is attempting to rise to the occasion. Rose, 4, took one look at Thomas and announced that she was going to teach him everything she knew, and Cade and Elara exchanged a look of comprehensive parental terror and complete delight. The years of 3 children were years of a particular richness and a particular exhaustion that were completely inseparable, and Elara would not have changed a moment of them. James grew into a tall and serious boy who spent his weekends on the mountain with his father, learning everything the mountain had to teach, moving through the wilderness with the same unhurried competence that was Cade's particular inheritance. Rose grew into a young woman of terrifying capability who decided at 12 that she intended to be a doctor, and her parents, having learned better than to argue with Rose's decisions, adjusted their plans accordingly. Thomas turned out to be the family's largest personality, laughing, social, endlessly curious, the child who befriended everyone in Clearwater and brought them all home for supper without warning, which drove his father to the edge of his sociable range and delighted his mother entirely. The schoolhouse in Clearwater grew too, through the 1880s, into a proper 2-room school with Elara heading it and Clara assisting, and then a third teacher was added, and the school was formalized into something the Territorial Education Board acknowledged, which meant paperwork and visits from inspectors and a level of bureaucratic oversight that Elara navigated with patience and occasional controlled fury. She built it into something that the children of Clearwater deserved, and she did not stop. Cade watched her all of this time with the steady, unfailing attention of a man for whom watching the person he loved work at the thing she was built for was one of the primary pleasures of existence. He told her once, in the plain way that was always his, that he thought she was the finest teacher in Colorado Territory, and when she pointed out that he had not actually seen a significant sample of Colorado's teachers, he said that he had seen enough of everything to know quality when he found it, and she had no useful response to that. By the late 1880s, Cade's leatherwork had developed into a genuine craft enterprise, with orders coming regularly from Denver and occasionally from cities further east. He had not sought this. It had found him, as things have a way of finding men of genuine skill who are not trying to sell themselves. He made saddles and bridles and belts and small goods, all of it marked by the same precise care he brought to everything, and each piece he made was better than the last. In small ways that only he and people who knew exactly what they were looking for would notice. They grew older with the steady grace of people who have treated their bodies and their lives as things worth maintaining. Cade at 40 was as physically formidable as he had been at 32, moving through the world with the same easy power, his dark hair now threaded with gray that made him look, Elara thought privately, even better in the way that certain faces are improved rather than diminished by the marks of time. She was 38 herself, and she moved through her days with the particular confidence of a woman who has spent 15 years building something real and knows exactly how well it has been built. On an evening in the fall of 1889, with James at 13 spending more nights on the mountain than off it, with Rose at 11 conducting what she described as medical experiments on her brothers, and with Thomas at 7 running the social affairs of the entire third-grade class with a natural authority that his teacher found both impressive and exhausting, Elara sat on the porch of the cabin on Hatchet Ridge and watched the sun go down over the valley, and Cade came and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. The aspens were at their gold. The air was clean and cold with the first real edge of autumn in it, and the sky went from orange at the horizon through a band of green into a deep and perfect blue overhead. The mountains were blue and rose and cream in the changing light, and the valley below was a carpet of gold and rust in the dark green of the pines. She had watched this view for 15 years. She would never stop being undone by it. "You are thinking," he said. "I am always thinking," she said. "What specifically?" he said. She considered. "I am thinking that this is the life, not a version of it or an approximation of it, the actual thing." He was quiet in the warm way, drinking his coffee. "I thought that for the first time on the mountain," he said. "The high meadow. The day you said you were not going back to St. Louis." "I remember," she said. "I thought it every day since," he said. Simply and entirely without self-consciousness, the way he said things he had decided were true and worth saying. She leaned her head against his shoulder, his considerable, solid, faithful shoulder, and he shifted to accommodate her the way the mountain shifted to accommodate the weather, not yielding exactly, but welcoming. Below them, the valley held its evening light. In the cabin behind them, the fire was going, and they could hear Thomas's voice asking Rose a question, and Rose's voice answering it with authority. James was somewhere on the ridge above, coming home by the route he knew as well as his own name. The ravens were calling somewhere in the pines, evening calls, settling down calls, the sound the mountain made when the day was ending properly. "Cade," she said. "Elara," he said, and her name in his mouth was still exactly what it had been in the high meadow 20 years ago, something entirely new and something that had always been there. "I'm glad I came west," she said. "I'm glad there was a bear," he said. She laughed, and he laughed too, low and warm, and the porch creaked under them, and the aspens shook in a breath of evening wind, and 1,000 gold coins flickered in the last light, and James appeared on the trail at the tree line, tall and moving through the dusk with his father's ease, and raised one hand in greeting when he saw them. Cade raised his hand back. Elara raised hers. The boy came down out of the trees and toward the light of the cabin, and the porch and the mountains and the evening were all one continuous thing, unbounded theirs.